So what is unwrapping? Unwrapping is basically the process of taking your polygon object and peeling it apart in a way that you can paint it in Photoshop or other texture painting softwares, possibly Substance or whatever you're painting with. So here's an example of unwrapping. You have the object that gets peeled apart, whether it's a square or a cylinder. You're peeling it open so that it can be painted. So if we do that again, you can see that it just gets peeled apart. And so once you've peeled apart these pieces, you'll get UV coordinates, I guess. So what they look like is, if we pull them up in Photoshop, you can see that it peels off, and that's the same pattern that we just peeled off for the square, and that's the same pattern we peeled off for the, I can turn those off, I guess, but it's the same pattern that we peeled off for the cylinder as well. So I painted these on here, and because I've painted them on here and we've already peeled off what it looks like, or what the polygons look like, this will automatically reapply what I've painted here onto the object, because this way the computer knows, since the pieces were peeled off, this piece right here will get an arrow head right there. This piece right here will get a circle right here, and the computer can match up where these pieces are that you peeled off, laid flat, and painted on to reassign back to here. So if I select these and put those textures back on there, so this one is the cube, and this one is the cylinder. And if I go and reassemble it now and press play, you'll see that it puts it back together with the memorized or notated place. So the circle is here, back to there, and the arrow peeled up and went across there, and the cylinder closed up as well. So essentially unwrapping is just opening your object in a way that you can paint it in a 2D artistic program and reapply it to your 3D objects. So let's do a couple examples. Over here, let's start with a plane. So I'm going to use the plane. These are under the modeling tools. You can use plane. So the plane that gets created on your grid, you can scale this upwards. And if I go to the UV editor, which is under UVs right here, UV editor, you'll see that the plane is already unwrapped. It's already flat, and we can paint whatever we want on here, and it'll appear right on here. So we don't really need to unwrap anything for a single plane. If I remove out the extra edge loops in there, set that to 10, you'll see that any change I make here applies to here. So the edges and vertices transfer over into the UV editor, but we don't need those in this case for that. And you may notice that we have on the grid coordinate, we have a 0 to 1 up here, and then also the 0 over to the 1 right here, and then it keeps going past that. So if I zoom out, Maya 2018 has a lot of grids on here, but essentially we're just going to stop at the 1 right here in both directions. Whatever we paint inside this grid portion will be what appears in on the surface and in the, let's say, Photoshop, for example. If I go outside of this, it starts repeating. So whatever I painted down here at 0 will start getting repeated at this line right here. So it just keeps repeating outside of the box. So you want to make sure everything that you unwrap stays inside of this box. All right, so there's not much we can really unwrap on a square, so I'm going to delete out the square. And then let's go over to a cube. So the cube already comes pre-unwrapped as well, and so does the rest of these shapes up here. So if I click on the cylinder, you'll see that the cylinder comes pre-unwrapped already. So we don't have to worry about unwrapping any of the basic shapes. But when we start creating more shapes, we're going to have to unwrap more of those shapes. So what we have here is the same process. If I, let's say, either I can right-click in either one of these. If I right-click inside here, I'll see a couple of different options, which are very similar to what I'll see here. I'll still see my face, my vertex on my edge, and then there's the UV over here, which is UVs and UV shell. If I go back over to here and right-click, I'll still see the edge, vertex, and face, but I have UV and UV shell over here. So they kind of slightly moved them, but that's what we have. Edge mode means I can click an edge, and you can see that when I click one, it lights up the corresponding other side that it's connected to, and it shows it where it is here. If I click off there and click here, you can see that it selects the one right here. because they're already connected, it already shows the line there. If I grab this one, you can see it is showing that these two lines are connected in 3D, but they've been peeled apart and cut open to be laid flat on the 2D plane. So that's how edge mode works, and the same thing with face mode. You can see which face is corresponding to which one on the 3D and 2D object. Vertex, you don't really use vertex mode in the UV editor. You can try and move these, but you probably shouldn't move vertices. It's more for the UVs. So you switch to UV mode, and when you move UVs, you move specific pieces. If you move a vertex and you grab the one, it's going to move both of them, because a vertex is one, but a UV can share multiple vertices. So usually you move things in UV mode, so you can kind of rearrange where these go. And changing anything in UV mode doesn't change your model, it just determines where the placement of your textures are going to appear on your model. If I wanted to cut these off and rearrange them, I can rearrange them if I want to. Also of note, over here we have a couple different options. This one is already on, it's the wireframe display, but I can switch this out to, let's say, shaded mode, and by clicking the left mouse button on there, it shows this is all in purple. That means that all the faces are correct and nothing is backwards or inside out. If I right click on the same button, it switches it out and shows which one is the same UV piece. If I were to cut this in multiple pieces, so it's not one solid attached piece, then I would get different colors, and I'll show that as we get to more complex examples. Switch back out to this one. This one over here, this one will kind of identify which are having distortions and not distortions, but we don't have any distortions on this cube, so everything is nice and clean and white. If I were to adjust it, we might have distortions. So let's say I go to UV mode and pull this out, you can start seeing that it's indicating there's distortions occurring and something is off. If I go, we'll skip some of these, and go to the checkered pattern, you can see that I'm getting distortions. The checker pattern should be nice and square, but because I pulled one piece, it's causing some distortions to occur, which is what the colors are indicating that you have distortions. If I Control Z and put that back into place, everything stays nice and square, nice and even squares. So then in this case, I know everything is correct as it should be. But if I keep moving these pieces, I start creating distortions, and Maya lets me know with colors that I'm messing up. If I switch this back off, it doesn't show that, but I can still see there are visual distortions. If I Control Z and put that back to place, everything goes back to normal. If I go to vertex mode and I were to grab one of these and pull this around, you can see that I'm getting distortions again depending on how I move things. And if I turn this back on, again it should show that I have distortions occurring on the surface. If I put that back in place, it should revert back to white because it's back to normal. Alright, so that's what that does. That's our checker pattern button. This one shows the texture map. If we had a texture attached to it, with which we've already painted in Photoshop, that would turn this one on, and this one turns on the grid pattern so we can see if there's distortions. Let's turn off the texture stretching option. This one over here, let's turn off the grid to make it easier to see. This one is showing the white line, so I know what is being cut and not cut. So if I click off on this, you can see it unhides the border edges, or the UV cut seams, or it hides them, and then it unhides them so I can see them again. So this is simply showing where my lines have been cut at, so I know which lines have been cut, which ones haven't. Otherwise it kind of shows it like that. So if you're in object mode and you're just building things and you see that you have these different color whites and greens, it's simply because you have this one checked on, which is showing you where your cut lines are. So if you want to turn that off, you can right there. This one over here, if we click on this one, it's showing you the shell borders. I guess I have to click on this guy, or there it is. So you can see the shell border is turning green because it's indicating what is actually a border edge, anything that's been cut before. If I were to select different colors or different pieces, it'll highlight which ones they are. It's already doing that in red right here, so you can kind of hover over top and see that. But if you click it manually, you'll see that. And if you click, let's say, in UV mode and select all these, you get the same thing. There is at times, if you click on something, you might see different colors occurring depending on how you're selecting, so it lets you know which ones match and which directions. But that's what the border edge is. And this one's the grid, turns the grid off and on. And this one over here, this is helpful for isolating what you're looking at. If you have, let's say, a face mode and I only want to see what this face is, I can isolate and just look at that one. It's not deleting them, it's just hiding the other ones around. If I want to see just these three and work on that, then I can isolate that. So it's isolation. And this right here will create the UV snapshot. It lets you create the texture map. So we'll get back to this part once we finish unwrapping. But usually once everything's clean and organized, that's when you would click the UV snapshot, set up your settings, and export that out. And this is what will go into Photoshop so you can color, which is what we already have here in Photoshop. We already have that one. It's already been exported and colored and then reassigned back in Maya. Alright, so that covers the main buttons up here and generally what they do. So let's go back to object mode. If I wanted to unwrap this, let's restart and reset the UVs so that it doesn't have them. So over here, you'll also notice there's a UV toolkit that gets loaded every time you open the UV editor. If for some reason you close that because it's in the way and you want to get that back, that is located over here under the Tools, Show UV Toolkit. If I click on that, it reopens the toolkit. The toolkit is new to Maya 2018 and it's quite helpful. They've made a lot of improvements to the UV editing system in Maya 2018, and they've moved a lot of the tools that are up here. You can see all the green ones are generally new. All these are added now into a toolkit on the side, so you don't have to keep jumping through all these menus. You can kind of leave them all open right here, which is a lot more convenient. So let's say I go to Create. I can create some UVs. Also, some of these tools and some of these are also located up in the UV editor right here, so I can go and create these cylindrical, planar, and spherical maps, which are located right here. So there's some tools up here, some here, and some here, but it's just easier to use them on the side right here. So I'm going to go with contour stretch, and that will erase all my UVs and kind of put them together. So whereas before I had those lines, Control Z, put that back to normal. Put this back on there. You can see the cut lines are on there. I want to erase the cut lines and put them all together. So that's what contour stretch will kind of link them all together, which just makes it a big mess. If I try and put that on Checkered Pattern, you can see that I'm getting a whole bunch of distortions. It's erased my UVs and allowed me to start over. So it's not something you want to do often, but if you want to just start over and clear it out, this one seems to work pretty well. There's a couple other ones on here as well. You can play with some settings. Cylindrical is more for, as you might guess, cylinders. Then spherical mapping for spheres. You have a couple other options in here. Automatic, you can use that one. It puts them all apart in pieces, but there's downsides to having them in pieces. Namely, if you paint on one side and your brush stroke goes across to this side, you have to guess where that's occurring over here. And I'll show an example of that later on where it doesn't quite match, and then it's just a lot more problematic if your pieces aren't glued together. So you have to figure out which edge over this one to that one has to be glued back together in order to avoid that issue. So usually if you want to automatic unwrap it, you can piece it back together afterwards, but with 2018 they have a lot of new tools to make it easier. So I'm just going to go back to the contour stretch by undoing what I had. The newest tool that they added is the 3D cut and sew tool. This one is really helpful in basically cutting apart your object in 3D. So I'm going to click on this tool, and once you're activated on this tool, all you have to do is start cutting where you want these pieces to go. By default, it might be in face mode, so you can just hold the right click button and go upwards to component and then go to edge mode. This way you can cut off the edges. So I'm going to click on edge mode so it doesn't highlight the faces anymore. And if I click on this right here, you see that it selects it. Usually it should cut it, but for the first time it tends to want to be double clicked. So if I double click it, or actually sometimes double click doesn't work either. I'm not sure why it doesn't always do that, but if you click with the left click and drag across, then it'll start cutting your pieces. So now it's cut. Now that I've already started cutting, now I can click it once or double click and it should cut the rest. It's generally how you cut the UVs, so you've you see the effects here, but we don't really know what's happening. So what I'm trying to do is strategically cut these pieces so it unfolds again. So I'm telling it, I want to cut here, and I want to cut here. So now the sometimes single click's working, sometimes double click works. I'm not sure why it switches out like that. So now I've cut this piece off completely, and you can see it changes colors now, which is what this option up here is by clicking left mouse. This is actually the right mouse. So the right mouse shows you all the pink is one group, it's all one piece. But this brown one is now its own separate UV shell. It's a separate piece that can detach from the original. By pressing left click, this shows me that I have a face of the object, whereas blue is its normal, but the reds are showing me that the face is upside down or backwards. And so I don't, at times you may want a backwards face, but generally backwards face means if you put writing and you say hi, H-I, you're going to get I-H because it's backwards, it's upside down in reverse like a mirror. So red is indicating that things are backwards. Blue is correct. Sometimes you might want that backwards effect to keep things mirror symmetrical, but sometimes you might not, so it's up to you. But the red indicates that. So right clicking on this will show me back to the shading groups to show me what are separate pieces now. If I were to click here and click here, it should cut this again. So now the pink is still one whole attachment, and now the green is a separate piece and the brown is a separate piece. I can alternatively just click and drag, and as I do that, it'll just keep cutting for me. So now I have three different pieces here and the fourth piece right here. Assuming I cut this out and I'm happy with this, this should lay flat, that should lay flat, and so should this. But this piece can't lay flat because it still has some edges connected. It's going to, in 3D in real life, it's going to still be sticking up on the paper. In order to flatten it, you have to squash it, which will cause distortions again. And so I'll demonstrate with that. So what we want to do now is unfold this. So I'm going to go press the W key on the keyboard, which is move. It gets me out of the 3D tool that I was in before, and then right click and go to object mode. Once we're in object mode, we can still see where the cuts are occurring at. And I'm going to go click on the unfold section right here, and I'm going to unfold. What unfold does is that it pulls all the pieces apart. So if I go to right click and UV shell, I can grab this shell and move it over, this shell, move it over, and this shell and move it over. So we can see that because I've drew the white lines around it, I've cut that section off, as well as this section and that section. I've cut all these off, but I never cut this one, and so it's trying to unfold it as best as it can. If I go to the grid pattern, you can see that the ones that I did cut straight in squares, that they're square patterns. But this one is giving me some distortion, so you can see here that it's not exactly square. You can get, there's different shapes inside of there. It's not laying completely flat, and so you're going to get distortion. So if you try and draw things or make shapes, you're going to get weird lines in there. Or not necessarily weird lines, but weird angles that it keeps stretching at. So we want to minimize distortion. If I turn that off and go back to this one, we can see that there should be an indicative. It's kind of a light red color, but you can see that there's a little bit of indication that there's some stretching occurring in that corner. I can turn that back off, and so what we want to do is keep cutting until we don't have those distortions. I can put this back on. It's just a little hard to see. You may notice also that they are squares, but the piece is turned at a diagonal angle, and because it's at a diagonal angle, what you're seeing are the diagonal edges right here. There's other ways to adjust that, which I'll get to in a little bit, but let me finish cutting this piece real quick. So let's go back to, I could do it manually, going to edge mode and cutting, or I can switch back out to the 3D cut and sew tool. So I'll click back on that, and let's double click, right click component and go to edge mode so I can click on the edge. So clicking it once, obviously cut it, sometimes it switches out. So I've got that once. Let's say I want to reattach this piece. So I'm going to hold Control and click on this, and it should relink that. See, it made it the same color again. Now it's pink. If I click it again, it cuts it again. If I hold Control and left click, it'll undo the seam, undo the cut, and re-sew it back together. So what we're seeing here in this mode, if I click it, it cuts it. I can go to, let's say, the Move tool, go to Face mode, click this, and move it away. And now let's try this again. Back to Object mode, UV, 3D cut, and so they're separated, but if I hold Control and click, it relinks them back together, so it puts them back together in the UV mode. So let's finish this up now. So this one's going to peel across that way, this will peel this way, this one we might as well reattach, so Control left click, and this one we might as well reattach, Control left click. So now it's very distorted, but it's all attached. So let's go back to, and I can't get to object mode until I've gotten out of the 3D tool, so I usually press W to get out of there, and then right click so I can get to object mode, and now it can unfold. So I click the unfold button and everything unfolds. So now it's nice and clean, everything's back to square shapes, and I've strategically put where I wanted those cut lines to get everything as flat as possible. And so now there should be no distortions because it's been laid out. You may notice that it's not completely turned in the right direction. You could manually turn that by pressing the rotate button. That's E on the keyboard, or just going to rotate. So move, rotate, and scale still apply to all these if you wanted to use them up here. So we need to select this. In order to select it, I need to, if you notice you can't grab it, I can turn off the checker pattern, but what I want to do is go into right click and pick one of these modes. UV shell is the easiest to use because it grabs the entire piece. Everything that's connected to this piece is now considered one shell. If I right click and go to face mode, I'll grab one piece, and if I go to move, which is the W key, I can pull one, but I don't want to pull one. I could drag across, grab all of them, and that would work, but it's just easier to go to UV shell, in which case one click will grab the whole thing for you, if that's what you're trying to get at or pick up. So now how do we adjust this? I could go to rotate, and I could try and manually get this as accurate as possible. That's one way. There's also an easier way if you have multiple objects on your screen. Looking down here at the arrange and layout options, I can expand that out, and you can see something called orient shells. If I click on this, it'll orient it in a nice straight pattern, and let's say that's what I'm looking for. Now what I want to do is put this inside of the 0 to 1 coordinate system. So what I can do at that point is press on layout, and layout will fit it inside of here. And now it's ready to export out to Photoshop, so I click on this and I just type in where do I want to save it at, what file format do I want, and what size do I want for the texture map. 2048 is a very large texture map size. You could use 1024 or you can go down to like 512. What happens is the larger the number, the better the quality you're going to get on your textures. There's more pixels being used, and you're going to get a lot more clearer and sharper pixels, texture clarity. So the lower the number, the less you're going to get. It's going to be more blurry. An example of that would be over here. This is a 512 map, 1024 and 2048. These are screen cap cutouts that I did. You can kind of see that this is a lot more blurry, and this gets more clear, and this is the clearest. The difference between 1024 and 2048 isn't super noticeable, so you could get away with 1024. The higher end games are going to use higher maps, but that means you're requiring more processing power of the game engine. So depending which you want to go, it's going to be faster and more efficient to run the 512s, but you're not going to get as much graphical quality. So you kind of have to pick and choose what you want, how far you're going to go with the graphical quality. You can see it's a lot more blurry in the words, a little more clear, and a lot more clear. So that's generally what the map sizes are. They're also in powers of 2, so 512 times 2 is 1024, 1024 times 2 is 2048. So the next one up would be 4096. But after a certain point, you may not notice the increased pixels being any better than before. No, I don't know what that means. No. Yes, so that's what the pixel or the dimensions are, or for what that is. So also there's edge color. You can switch out between like black and white, and so what that does is in Photoshop you'll see the different, minimize that. So we got the different edge colors. This is black. You can switch to white if you wanted to invert that, so that's what that one's showing. So once you're done, you just browse and just press apply, and that's going to save out your texture, and you'll get what you just saw in Photoshop. So that's how that works for the UV snapshot. So let's close out that and get back to where we were. So that's generally how you would unwrap a box. So let's do one more. Let's go jump out object mode and jump over to make a cylinder. So let's make a cylinder, slide this guy over to the side, and let's start unwrapping. Again, it comes pre-unwrapped as all these shapes do up here. But let's say we wanted to reset this. I'm going to go to the contour stretch and just wipe that out and start over. So let's go over to the UV 3D cut and sew. So I'm going to click that, and I can hold. You can see here it's definitely very distorted, very needs a lot of fixing. So if I turn off the grid, or not the grid, the checker pattern, we don't really need to see that. Let's also right-click component, go to edge mode, or else I can't select the edges. Click and drag carefully across this. If I miss and go too high up, sometimes it'll grab some of the other lines like that. Another faster way of doing that, instead of manually, going and grabbing too many lines, I can just double-click this and it'll automatically grab it. Double-clicking usually follows through on the, it just figures out where to go pretty much. So if I double-click here, it'll also select it, or it can manually click by click everything, and that should unwrap. I'm going to do one more vertical line, or else this piece going around won't be able to peel, but I'll show you what that looks like. Alternatively, instead of going to pressing the move key and getting back to object mode, I can hold the right click, go to component and UV shell, and then I can grab the UV shell, and that'll allow me to unfold it this way. So I can go to unfold, and it'll unfold. The downside of this is that I can't get to the object UV shell and all that stuff through here, so I usually have to switch out anyway to the move tool, hold right click, and then go to UV shell, and then I can start moving things around, and thus I can do that. Also notice that this piece right here, if I turn back on the checker pattern, you can see that it's still distorting because it doesn't have a clean cut to cleanly open that. It's kind of all mismatched together. So if I go through and let's say right click, I can do this manually. I can go to edge mode right here and just manually click an edge and go to the cut and sew tool and just manually cut it. You could go to 3D cut and sew, but you can also do things manual. So now let's go to UV shell, select all these, and let's go to unfold. When you unfold, it'll fix the pattern just like that. Also of note, you can set the unfold to be a little more helpful. Let's say Control Z that, so this was like that, and let's say when you have your pieces, you might remember before it was kind of all stacked together. I can select all these, or even before I select it, just hold Shift and left click the unfold button, and you bring up the settings. If you hold Shift and click any of these, it'll bring up the unfold each setting for each different button. I want to click on Pack. By clicking Pack and then apply and close, you notice it unfolds it and it moves it off so it's not sticking on top of each other. It's usually pretty helpful to do. There's a couple other options inside here. You can do the room space, which is how close are these edges being touching. If they're like 1 pixel apart, it's really hard to, well, not really hard, but when you paint in Photoshop, you may paint over top the other textures. So if you adjust this to something a little more, let's say 4 pixel difference, and then press apply and close, it should move it 4 pixels apart. Let's try that again. So UV shell, select everything, and unfold. So apparently it's, not separating. 8. Oh, no, not doing it. All right, so not sure why that option isn't quite working, and maybe I've got the wrong one. There's also the other option down here. If I turn off Checkered Pattern, a little easier to see. Under Layout, if you hold Shift and click that, you can set it here also. If I do Layouts, let's move over here, just press Apply. So Layout will automatically fill it also, and whereas Unfold, it didn't quite fill it maximally. It fit it inside of here, but it didn't fully lay it out. So if I press Layout, it'll fill it. Over here, the distance, the space between here, is going to be your percentage space right here. So I can set that to, let's say, 0.04. And then press Apply. And now it spaces it apart a little better. So apparently it's under the Layout one and not under the Unfold option. Also, you may want to set this to a single or multiple objects. This way you don't get overlapping objects sometimes. And you may want to set this to free so it'll organize it a little better on its own. So if I press Apply, now it's able to rotate it and fit it and organize things a little easier and cleaner. So sometimes you may want to play with some of the settings like that. But more or less you have a nice clean UV layout. If I put this back in here, you can see everything's nice, clean, and organized. The only other issue now Notice the difference on the squares. This one's a lot more dense on texels, which means you're going to have more pixels. And the more pixels you have, the better clarity you're going to get, the crisper the image. This one has a lot larger squares, which means it's going to be more of a blurry image because it's using less. The more it uses, the more quality you're going to get. So since there's 3 different sizes right here, I'm going to kind of make them all uniform. Some objects you may want to have more pixels in, let's say, the face of a character than on the bottom of their feet, which you won't likely see. So you can change the density to certain parts, but maybe for this object you want to have everything uniform because you're going to see it from all dimensions. So in order to do that, let's unclick that, and we pick one of these shapes. So right click and go to UV shell mode, and pick one of these. If you want to have them all be this size, or you want to have them all be this size, it doesn't really matter. So let's grab this one, and let's say I'm going to go over to the, it's under transform. If I expand out transform, there's get. If I get the textile density of this piece, I can then click on this piece and say set it, and it'll set it to the same textile density, so now they're equal. I can do the same thing for this one also and set it, and it'll expand it out so that everything now shares the same amount of texels. Alternatively, I could just select all of them at once. Once I got one, I can just set them all at once and just save myself some time. As you can see, it also doesn't fit anymore. So now if I go to layout, and because I've made some adjustments on the settings where I've set this, if I leave this with the overlapping and press apply, I guess it still works. So I guess maybe it doesn't matter which one you set, it should still do the same thing. Yeah, same thing. So it doesn't matter. But it also allows it to free on the rotation if it needs to move around. And so that moves it around. So now everything is the exact same shape square and the same size square, and everything's laid out. I can move this over here if I want to be a little more organized, so I can save this space for maybe something else, or I can put it down here, let's say, and I can reuse another object and texture in the same space, so I can conserve texture maps. So you can put multiple different objects on the same single texture map. So if I had another cylinder, I could maybe, a smaller cylinder, let's say, put it in here, so that you're not wasting space. And that pretty much covers how to texture multiple different objects in the new features of Maya 2018. So I guess the next part is just keep going at it, and yeah, and we'll cover more on when we get to later, the more advanced things, how to create more intricate cutting out of pieces. Oh, and one more thing to cover, in case you have this problem. Let's say I make a square, or in this case I'm going to make something a bit different. Let's make it a rectangle. So now I've got a rectangle. If I take this guy and I go to unfold, you may notice that it doesn't actually fix the stretching. Why is that? It's unfolded. It should fix it, but it doesn't fix it. The reason is because it thinks it's still a square. The Z scale, we've scaled it. When I made this larger or whatever, it thinks it is still a square plus this. So we need to get rid of this so that it thinks that it's not a square. So if we go over to modify, freeze, transformations, it'll freeze that out. I can also wipe out the history on this if I want. It's under edit, delete by type, history. And that clears that out. That's not as important, but clearing out the transformations is important. So now when I press unfold, it'll unfold correctly. So it just doesn't know that it's been scaled. So if you go and scale some squares around and it's not unfolding correctly and looking correct, it's just a matter of adjusting that and freezing those transformations. Also of note, you can see that it's not quite the most efficient way of doing this, because you're going to get a lot of seams on the edges. We can reduce that. Let's go to orient so it straightens it out. And then let's go to edge mode, and I can either go back to the UV 3D tool and just kind of manually redo this, or I can manually cut it myself and say, I want this one and this one. So I've selected the two edges, and then I want to go and cut over here, cut those edges, and then let's go to this edge, and let's go to stitch together. Sew works also, but it kind of moves them to the center. Stitch will move one towards the other, and it moves both pieces over there. So that moved it together, and let's repeat this process. Click this one, cut it, pick one of these, and stitch together, and that manually moves it. If I want to keep this symmetrical, I could move this again, cut over here. So, oops, that's so. stitched together, moves it over there. Let's turn that off. So you can see it kind of makes it a little more organized. Now if I go to UV shell, click on this guy, and go to layout, he'll fit a lot more of the texture space, a little more clear. And if I go back to here, it didn't really change much except that the texels got more denser because it takes up more space. So when you make your objects, you want them to take up as much space as possible. In this case, it takes up more space, but it also leaves the 0 to 1 grid, and you don't want to leave that because it's going to not texture correctly. You want to stay inside of here, but you want to take up as much space as you possibly can. So you can also share the same texture for different objects. So like the cylinder, I could take the cylinder and put this in here, and then let's scale him down so that he can fit, and probably rotate him. Let's turn that off and rotate that direction. Or not, it might not exactly fit. I could always just rotate arbitrarily and put it at that angle if I want to kind of fit it that way. But I'm gonna, I guess it's fine to leave it that way. It does fit the texture space that way. Also of note, we want to compare and see what the texels are. So this one right here has a lot larger texels than this one, so I want to make them all uniform. So I'm going to say this one get and this one set, and now it's the same equal. At this point it's much larger than this one, so maybe I don't want to put them in the same space. So it all depends, but you can combine different, reuse the same textures. They'll still be different objects and they'll still share separate maps, but you can put them back and forth. But I don't want to leave this one up there. Oops. I want to put this one back down in the 0 to 1 and scale that back in and put it somewhere that I can reuse it. So now those are both good to go. Cool. And that should about cover all of that object mode.